My field designation was Acoustic Cartographer, 3rd grade, assigned to the Vethric Institute of Exo-Resonance Studies. My colleagues called me Sen, which in our tongue carries the sense of one who listens before others think to. I was good at my work. I had catalogued tidal harmonics from gas giants, mapped the subsonic groaning of dying moons, and once spent 11 months aboard a drift station, recording the precise vibrational signature of a neutron star's crust as it settled after a seismic event. I was not easily unsettled by sound. That is why they sent me to the border. The sector had appeared in our charts for centuries under the designation vreth-nallin, a galactic standard phrase that translates loosely as the resonant anomaly, or in older dialects, the place that hums. Every deep survey probe dispatched into that region had returned garbled signal traces, acoustic data, so densely layered and internally complex that our instruments could not parse it into anything meaningful. The standing interpretation among Institute scholars was geological, a system of particularly massive planets in close orbital resonance, perhaps, instances of crystalline asteroids vibrating in harmonic sympathy. The sounds, whatever their origin, described in the archived survey notes as extraordinary but not dangerous. As beautiful even, in the clinical vocabulary our field sometimes uses for phenomena that exceed expectation. Those notes stopped being updated roughly 400 years ago. I assumed the research thread had simply gone dormant for lack of funding. It was not an unusual fate for long-running, deep border surveys. I was wrong about that. I would be wrong about several things before the end. The Council's official commission instructed me to enter vreth-nallin, establish a stable monitoring position at no less than 3 light minutes. Inside the advisory boundary, conduct a full-spectrum acoustic survey, and return with catalogued data sufficient to reclassify the anomaly. The sector sat within the outer margin of what the older charts called restricted human space, a designation I had always understood to be a political boundary, not a scientific one. The humans I was given to understand, a young and territorial species who had staked claim to a large corridor of space they could not yet fully inhabit. Vreth-nallin, my commission noted, lay in a region the humans had never formally occupied. The sound, therefore, was surely geological. I brought a crew of 5. Veth, my instruments technician, 2 data processors whose names I will not record here because I do not know what became of them, a navigation specialist named Orvas, and a young cadet, newly assigned, whose first deep border survey this was. I remember her clearly. She was attentive and asked careful questions, and on the transit she spent her off hours. In the observation bay, watching the star field, she would have made an excellent cartographer. We crossed the advisory boundary on the morning of the 5th transit day. The sound reached us before any instrument registered it. I want to be precise about that, because it is the detail that still troubles me most when I sit with this record and try to reconstruct what happened. Veth reported nothing on any band. Not acoustic, not electromagnetic, not any of the proxy channels we use to translate deep space resonance into ranges our species can process. The instrument said nothing. But we all heard it, or we felt it, or we knew it was there, which is perhaps the most accurate description I can give. It was below hearing in the way that very large things are below hearing. Not absent, present in a register that bypasses the ear and arrives directly in the body, in the chest, in the cavity behind the eyes. A low, sustained, textured sound that was unmistakably not geological. Geological resonance has a texture. It is grinding, or tidal, or the irregular breathing of rock under pressure. This was structured. This had internal coherence. This had... And I understood this within the first few minutes of crossing the boundary, and have never found a better word for it. Intention. I ordered Orvis to hold position at 6 light minutes inside the boundary and began my survey from there. On the 2nd hour of observation, the instruments finally began to register. What they returned was not what they were designed to process. Our acoustic mapping tools are calibrated for the expected frequency ranges of planetary and stellar phenomena. What our vreth-nallin produced sat in a range our instruments could technically detect but had no analytic framework to interpret, because the range in question is the range of massed human vocalization. The tools were not designed for that. No one had thought to design for that. I pulled the archived survey notes that night, the ones from 400 years ago, and read them properly for the first time. The researchers who had preceded me, a team of 12, well-equipped, from what I could reconstruct, had documented the same early readings. They had noted the same quality of structural coherence. They had used in their notes words I recognized: layered, intentional, harmonic, gathered. On the 43rd day of their survey, they had moved to 3 light minutes, as their commission had instructed. On the 44th day, their transmissions became irregular. On the 49th day, the last log entry read in its entirety, "It is not one voice." After that silence, I ran the count in our archive. Not one survey team but 7. 7 teams across 4 centuries, each dispatched with slightly different instruments, each arriving at the same observations, each going quiet at roughly the same point. The gaps between surveys grew longer each time. Whoever reviewed the prior team's data had waited longer and longer before commissioning the next. 1. The last survey before mine had been 211 years ago. Whatever the council had read in that team's final transmissions, it had waited 2 centuries before trying again. They had sent me. I ran the calculation 3 times, 7 teams, 4 centuries. The intervals between them growing wider each time. The way a species unconsciously spaces its attempts at something it does not want to admit it is afraid of. No recovery missions, no secondary surveys to determine what had happened to the prior crews. Only this: someone had read the last transmissions, waited, and eventually commissioned another team. I was the 8th. I wondered, sitting with that number, how long the council had debated before signing my commission. I decided I did not want to know. I did not move to 3 light minutes. I want that recorded. I held position, ran my survey from 6, and began the process of organizing my data for transmission. I was not incurious. I understood by then that what filled vreth-nallin was not a geological phenomenon, and was not, in any conventional sense, natural. It was human, wholly, overwhelmingly human. The sector was saturated with it, with massed human voice layered over centuries of accumulation, frequencies folding over, frequencies in a structure so complex that our instruments could map its surface, but could not find its bottom. It was as though every human voice that had ever been raised in full-throated, collective sound, in ceremony, in grief, in ecstatic unified declaration, had been leaving some faint residue in this region of space for as long as humans had existed, and the residue had gathered and thickened, and after long enough had become something the void simply held. Whether the humans had done this deliberately, I cannot say. I do not believe they had. I believe it is simply what they are, and what they leave behind wherever they are sufficiently concentrated. A species that produces this, even passively, from the mere fact of living in the same space for long enough. I do not have a scientific classification for what that species is. The Institute's frameworks were not built for them. On the 7th day of our survey, I noticed that Orvas had stopped responding to routine check-ins. I found her in the observation bay, facing the viewport, not moving. She was breathing, her eyes were open. She was listening to something I could no longer hear. Or perhaps I had simply stopped noticing that I was hearing it, which is not the same thing. The cadet was beside her. I did not try to move them. Veth helped me compile the transmission. We sent everything, all the data, the archive cross-reference, my analysis, the count of 7 prior teams. We inclusive for a formal recommendation for boundary reclassification. Expand the restricted margin outward. Increase the advisory distance from its current figure to something that leaves room for what lives inside it. Vreth-nallin, not as an acoustic anomaly and not as a geological curiosity, but as what it is, a region in which human resonance has accumulated to a depth and density that our instruments cannot fully measure and our crew cannot safely approach. I do not know if Veth and I made it back across the boundary. I have no memory of the transit. I have the transmission record. I have this account which I am completing from notes I apparently made on the 7th day, before Orvas stopped responding. If someone at the Institute is reading this, then the data arrived, and the transmission held, and some portion of our survey was recovered intact. If the Council acts on our recommendation, the sector will be widened. Vreth-nallin will be absorbed into the restricted margin, and the charts will be redrawn to include it. And somewhere inside that widened margin, in a place the maps will no longer name, the sound will continue. It was doing so before we arrived. It will do so after we are gone. It was never waiting for us to notice it. It was simply, as it had always been, awake.